the windows, illuminating the steam curling above her coffee cup. She adjusted the sleeve of her gray sweater, subtly revealing the tattoo on her forearm, a pair of angel wings cradling a set of dog tags. To her, it was more than ink. It was memory. It was love. It was grief. Each feather, each detail had been painstakingly designed to honor someone irreplaceable. Her brother, Corporal Michael Sanders, who had given his life in Afghanistan. The hummed with its usual rhythm, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clatter of silverware against ceramic plates, and the soft chatter of patrons. But in the midst of this ordinary morning felt the weight of eyes she couldn't see. She sensed it first as a ripple of tension across the tables nearby, then as stifled laughter. A group of locals had noticed her tattoo. Whispering, nudging each other, they began to mock it quietly at first, then with increasingly audible chuckles. "What's that supposed to mean?" one said, smirking. "Trying to look tough, huh?" Another laughed, leaning closer to get a better look. They didn't know the story. They didn't know the sacrifice. All they saw was ink, and they judged. His heart tightened. She kept her gaze on the swirling coffee, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup, and she felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to escape. Memories of her brother flashed through her mind, his smile, his laugh, the way he would tease her relentlessly, yet always protect her. She took a deep breath and forced herself to remain composed, as she had done countless times in the past 5 years since Michael's death. Across the room, a man watched silently. Colonel James, a decorated Marine nearing the end of his distinguished career, sat alone at a table near the window. His uniform, crisp even in civilian attire, suggested authority, but it was his eyes that held the story. They were sharp, observant, and full of understanding. He noticed the mockery, the laughter that masked ignorance, and the quiet dignity with which endured it. Colonel had been in situations where respect was violated. In the military, honor was everything. The bond between soldiers, between those who served and the families who bore their sacrifices, was sacred. He could see that tattoo was not a fashion statement, not a rebellion. It was a story, etched in ink, of a love lost and a life honored. The laughter grew louder. His pulse quickened. Her hands gripped the cup a little too tightly, her knuckles whitening. She could feel the room shrinking around her. Her chest tightened, and she pressed her lips together to stop them from trembling. She reminded herself she was strong. She had survived grief, loss, and loneliness. She would not let strangers diminish her brother's memory. Observed quietly, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He didn't move immediately. He didn't speak. Part of him wanted to confront the mockers outright, to deliver a lesson they wouldn't forget. But he knew that actions often spoke louder than words, and the moment had to be right. He studied instead. He saw resilience in her posture, grief in her eyes, and quiet pride in the way she held herself despite the ridicule. For the tattoo was a private story made public by necessity. She remembered the day she had gotten it, sitting in a small tattoo studio just days after Michael's memorial service. The pain of the needle had mirrored the pain in her heart, but with each line etched, she felt closer to him. This was how she carried him, permanently, visibly, proudly. She remembered his laughter from childhood, the way he would always chase her around their backyard until she collapsed in giggles. She remembered the day he had left for deployment, a promise on his lips that he would return safely. And then she remembered the phone call she never wanted, the one that changed her life forever. The folded flag, the solemn words, the impossibility of accepting a life gone too soon. Now, 5 years later, the tattoo was her armor and her vulnerability at the same time. It was a shield she wore for herself, but also a silent plea to the world. Do not forget. Do not mock what you cannot understand. The laughter across the continued, harsher now, as the mockers grew bold. "Yeah, nice wings," one jeered. "You think this makes you tough or something?" Another snorted. Chest tightened further. She felt her face flush with anger and humiliation, but she said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the swirl of cream in her coffee. She could feel herself being pulled back into the grief she had long tried to contain. Set down his cup and leaned back in his chair. His mind worked quickly. He had seen courage in countless forms on the battlefield, in training, and the quiet moments when civilians didn't notice. But courage often went unrecognized outside the service, and he saw that had been wronged in that moment. She deserved more than mockery. She deserved recognition, and if no one else would provide it, perhaps it was time for him to act. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, preparing for the moment that could change everything. The room's chatter was a dull roar in his ears, but his focus was sharp. Seated just a few tables away, looked small and fragile, yet incredibly strong. He could feel the weight of her story in the silence between her and the mockers. He would make sure that weight was recognized, honored, and respected. Didn't notice him moving yet, but she felt a subtle shift in the room, a presence, heavy and unwavering, that made her chest tighten for a reason she couldn't name. She pressed her lips together, trying to steady her breath. Whatever happened next, she told herself, she would stand tall. She had survived loss before. She could survive ridicule. Colonel stood, the room seeming to pause with him. Every eye was on him, though no one realized why. The mockers assumed he would join them, maybe even laugh at the spectacle. They didn't know his history, his losses, or his understanding of sacrifice. And as he moved towards table, the silence he carried with him was louder than any words could ever be. In that moment, the became more than a place of breakfast and coffee. It became a stage for honor, memory, and the quiet power of respect. His heart raced, not knowing what would happen next. But even in the uncertainty, there was a strange comfort in knowing someone else had seen her story, truly seen it, and understood its meaning. Colonel James sat at his table near the window, the morning light glinting off his watch as he sipped the last of his coffee. He had seen grief in its form, had watched men and women in uniform bear the weight of loss, yet there was something in Sanders that pierced deeper than most. It wasn't just the tattoo on her arm, angel wings cradling dog tags. It was the quiet strength beneath her trembling hands, the way her eyes, though downcast, carried a story that demanded respect. He had spent over 30 years in the Marines, rising from a young second lieutenant to the rank of colonel, earning commendations and scars along the way. He had led men into combat, navigated impossible missions, and witnessed acts of heroism that would haunt him forever. But he had also learned that honor was not always recognized by the world outside the uniform. Civilians often overlooked the sacrifices of those who served, or the families who silently bore the cost. Now, sitting in a small town, he realized he was witnessing another kind of battlefield. One with no medals or rank, no orders or strategy, just a young woman, her tattoo, and a group of people who thought it was something to mock. He could feel the injustice as acutely as if it had happened on a parade ground. The laughter from the nearby tables grew louder. "You think that tattoo makes you tough?" one man jeered. "Looks like a kid playing at being a soldier." Another chuckled, slapping his friend on the shoulder as if to say, "Look at this spectacle." Remained seated, her hands gripping her coffee cup tightly. She was trying not to cry, but the sting of humiliation was undeniable. Every laugh, every whispered comment felt like a sharp needle piercing her heart. She could feel her pulse quicken, and yet she refused to retaliate. That would not honor her brother. That would not honor her grief. Colonel set down his empty cup, his senses heightened. He studied the room with a disciplined gaze. He noticed the subtle body language of each person, the smugness of the mockers, the discomfort of other patrons who had turned their attention away, afraid to get involved. But most importantly, he focused on the way her posture remained upright, the slight quiver in her fingers, the quiet dignity that refused to break under ridicule. He thought back to his own experiences, remembering the day he had lost Sergeant Mark, his closest friend in the Marines. The explosion had been sudden, a violent reminder of how fragile life was in a world of chaos and war. He had watched fall and had been powerless to stop it. The grief had followed him everywhere, shaping the man he became. And now, seeing, he recognized the same pain etched into her being, a pain that came from the loss of someone irreplaceable, someone who had carried their own weight of courage and sacrifice. Mind wandered briefly as memories of her brother surfaced. She remembered Michael's laughter during their childhood, the way he would chase her through their backyard, daring her to run faster, teasing her when she stumbled. She remembered his solemn promise before his deployment, a promise that he would return safely. And she remembered the phone call she never wanted, the one that delivered the unthinkable news. She had collapsed into grief, but somehow in the days that followed, she had found a way to keep him alive through her tattoo. The angel wings and dog tags were more than ink. They were a shield, a symbol of resilience, a permanent tribute to the bond they had shared. Every time she looked at them, she felt a mixture of sorrow and pride, mourning his absence but celebrating his life. And yet, here she was in a small, subjected to the ignorance of people who could not and would not understand. Colonel's mind worked swiftly. He had a decision to make. He could confront the mockers directly, perhaps with words, but that could escalate the situation unnecessarily. He could ignore it, letting face the humiliation alone, but that was unthinkable. No one deserved that kind of disrespect, especially not someone who carried the memory of a fallen soldier with her so visibly, so proudly. Instead, he decided on a silent approach, one that would communicate more than words ever could. He observed the group again, noting the way they assumed dominance over the room, how they thought their laughter was harmless fun. They didn't know the power of history, the weight of service, the gravity of loss, and that ignorance, realized, would soon be corrected. Shifted in her seat, sensing a subtle presence moving closer. She didn't look up immediately. Her chest tightened and her mind raced with uncertainty. Who was this man? Was he going to say something? Or worse, join in the ridicule? She forced herself to take a deep breath, steadying the tremor in her hands. Her strength came not from confrontation but from composure, from honoring the memory of her brother through restraint. Finally stood, the room noticing the subtle change in posture. He was not aggressive, nor did he need to be. The quiet authority that came with years of service radiated from him. He moved slowly, deliberately, towards table. Every step was measured, his presence commanding attention without uttering a single word. He noticed fingers gripping her cup tightly, her knuckles white, and he understood the story she carried. He remembered his own experiences, the moments of loss, the weight of honor, the bond between those who served and those who waited at home. And he knew that the action he was about to take would speak louder than anything else. The once filled with chatter and laughter seemed to pause. Patrons unconsciously sensed the shift, the impending gravity of the moment. The mockers, still smug, had no idea what was coming. They assumed he would simply glance and move on, perhaps offer a polite smile. They did not know the power of a Marine's silent respect, the force of empathy forged in decades of service and sacrifice. His heart raced. She could feel it, the tension in the air, the gaze on her, the unspoken understanding that something significant was about to happen. And while fear mingled with curiosity, she found comfort in the silent attention of someone who seemed to see her fully, not as a spectacle, but as a person. Colonel's approach was steady, measured, intentional. He was fully aware of the room's focus, of the mocker's ignorance, and of his fragile courage. And as he reached her table, he understood that this moment was more than just about a tattoo, more than about humiliation. It was about honor, about memory, about ensuring that sacrifice was recognized and respected, even in the most unlikely of places. The stage was set. Silence reigned, heavier and more powerful than words. And for Sanders, the next moments would change everything. Sanders sat quietly, the distant sound of the fatting as memories rushed back, unbidden, flooding her mind with vivid clarity. Her tattoo, visible now to all but not fully understood, was more than ink. It was a story written in grief, love, and memory. Angel wings spread across her arm, cradling dog tags, a permanent tribute to her brother, Corporal Michael Sanders. The memory of him was as alive in her mind as if he had just walked into the moments ago. Michael had been 2 years older than a brother whose laughter had always filled the corners of her life. As children, they had been inseparable, running through sunlit backyards, climbing trees, and inventing games that only they understood. He had a mischievous streak, always teasing her relentlessly, yet beneath that playful cruelty lay a protective love that had never wavered. She remembered the night before he left for deployment in Afghanistan. Their parents had tried to maintain calm, but the tension in the house was palpable, had hugged him tightly, trying to memorize the warmth of his embrace. "You'll be okay," she whispered, though she did not truly believe it. Michael smiled, his hands gently holding her shoulders. "I'll come back," he promised. "I always come back." That was his way, bold, confident, unshakable. The following days were filled with anxious waiting and whispered conversations over the phone. Would ask mundane questions, trying to distract herself from the gnawing fear in her chest. He would answer with humor, deflecting worry with jokes and playful reassurance. But deep down, she knew that war was unforgiving, and that nothing could guarantee his safe return. Then came the day that changed everything. The call she had dreaded arrived, sharp and cold, delivered by a uniformed officer with solemn eyes. Corporal Michael Sanders had been killed in action. The words seemed impossible, as though her mind refused to translate them into reality. Her world fractured in an instant. She remembered sitting on her bedroom floor, clutching her knees, unable to breathe, while tears streamed uncontrollably down her face. The folded flag they delivered was a cruel, silent testimony to a life ended too soon. Grief became her constant companion. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, each moment carrying the weight of absence. Friends and family offered condolences, but few truly understood. Had tried to speak, tried to articulate the depth of loss, yet words felt hollow against the enormity of what she felt. And so she sought another way to remember him, to carry him with her always. It was then that she decided to get the tattoo. She had found a small tattoo studio in town, a quiet place where the artist listened to her story before ever touching the needle. She had described her brother, his bravery, his laughter, the bond they shared, and the artist had sketched angel wings cradling dog tags, a visual representation of a memory she could never let go. The day she received the tattoo had felt a mixture of pain and release. Each line etched into her skin was a physical manifestation of the emotional scars she carried. It was her armor and her vulnerability, her pride and her grief, all in one. Every glance at her arm reminded her of Michael, the brother she had loved, the hero she had lost, and the bond that death could never sever. Yet the tattoo was not just about remembering Michael. It was about asserting the value of memory in a world that often overlooked sacrifice. She wore it proudly, knowing that some might not understand. Some might even mock it as they were doing now. But for it was sacred. It was a conversation with her brother that no one else could interrupt or diminish. Her thoughts were interrupted by the low murmur of a harsh reminder that the world often failed to recognize what was sacred. The group of locals at a nearby table continued their mocking, unaware of the story they were trivializing. "Looks like someone's trying to be edgy," one laughed. Another snickered, leaning back in his chair, confident in his ignorance. His chest tightened. She took a deep breath, trying to ground herself in the present. Her mind returned to Michael, his smile, his promises, the moments that made up a life she could never fully reclaim. She remembered his voice, firm yet gentle. "Live your life. Don't let the world make you forget who you are or who we are." Those words had become her mantra, the foundation upon which she carried forward, even in the face of mockery. Across the colonel noticed the subtle trembling of her hands, the faint quiver in her lips. He understood the significance of the moment, how the past and present collided in a young woman's quiet struggle. He had experienced similar loss in his life. The death of Sergeant Mark had left a scar on his heart, one that time could not heal. Yet he had learned that memory and honor could be carried forward silently, through action and empathy. He observed her posture carefully. She was bracing herself, yet her back remained straight, her shoulders squared despite the invisible weight pressing down on her. That balance of strength and vulnerability told him everything he needed to know. She was someone who had endured unspeakable pain and yet continued to exist with dignity. That dignity deserved recognition. As he continued to watch, reflected on the importance of silent understanding. Words could fail, explanations could be dismissed, but presence, intentional, unwavering presence, could communicate volumes. He knew that the moment required a gesture, a visible acknowledgement of what carried, both the grief and the pride intertwined in her tattoo. The itself seemed to hold its breath. The mockers continued their laughter, unaware of the approaching shift in energy. Patrons sensed something profound in the air, an unspoken tension that hinted at an imminent revelation. Unaware of how close the moment was, focused inward, tracing the outline of her tattoo with her fingers and drawing strength from the memory of her brother. Her mind wandered back one last time to Michael's final letter, written weeks before his deployment. He had reminded her to live fully, to be brave, and to honor those who came before her. It was a message she had carried with her every day, guiding her choices, shaping her courage, and strengthening her resolve. And now, faced with ridicule, she drew on that courage once more, ready to endure what the world did not yet understand. Colonel rose from his seat, moving with deliberate calm towards table. Every step was measured, intentional, carrying with it the weight of decades of service and the silent respect for those who had sacrificed everything. He understood that the confrontation, when it came, would not be about words, but about presence, understanding, and honor. His heart pounded as she felt the space around her shift, though she did not yet see him. She took a steadying breath, recalling Michael's voice, his laughter, his promise to always protect. In that moment, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope, that someone might finally recognize the story etched into her skin, the memory she carried, and the strength she had endured to survive grief and ridicule alike. The stage was set. History, memory, grief, and honor converged in the small, all unnoticed by those who had thought this was merely a morning of idle gossip. But for Sanders and Colonel James, it was a moment that would forever change the meaning of respect, silence, and recognition. There had once been a haven for Sanders, a quiet space where she could sip her coffee and think, unobserved and unjudged. But now, the laughter from the table of locals gnawed at the edges of her composure. Each snicker felt like a jab, each whispered insult a tiny fracture in her carefully constructed armor. She had endured grief, hardship, and the weight of her brother's absence, yet the cruelty of strangers pierced deeper than she expected. The first comment had been quiet, almost subtle, meant to catch only the attention of the table nearby. "What's that tattoo supposed to mean?" one man said, smirking, as if merely curious, but curiosity quickly twisted into mockery. Another chimed in with a laugh, louder this time. "Looks like someone's trying to be a soldier or something." Stomach tightened. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks but forced herself to keep her gaze down, not giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. The mocking continued, escalating in confidence. "Yeah, wings and dog tags. What is she, some kind of hero wannabe?" someone jeered. The words were casual, light on malice yet heavy with ignorance. Hands trembled slightly as she gripped her coffee cup, knuckles turning white. She could feel herself withdrawing, retreating inward as the laughter surrounded her like a storm she could not escape. Across the Colonel James' gaze remained fixed on her. He had been trained to observe, to read people and situations carefully, and he immediately recognized the signs of emotional strain. Hands were tense. Her posture was defensive but composed. Her eyes, though lowered, glimmered with unspoken pain and quiet pride. He knew she was bracing herself against something far larger than this patron's. She was carrying the weight of grief, memory, and the need to honor her brother. His military instincts flared. He had seen the world's worst and its most oblivious, and he understood that sometimes people failed to recognize what was sacred. He knew that tattoo was not simply an accessory, not a statement of rebellion or fashion. It was a deeply personal tribute to a life lost, a permanent mark of love and remembrance, and to see it ridiculed stung him in ways he could not ignore. He studied the mockers closely. They were ordinary people, oblivious to the magnitude of the sacrifices they mocked. Their laughter was ignorant, thoughtless, and unaware that it was cutting into someone's soul. His mind raced through the possibilities. A direct confrontation could escalate into a scene, disrupting and potentially humiliating the group further. Ignoring it was unthinkable. The balance between action and discretion, a skill honed over decades of service, guided his next steps. Meanwhile, Drew in a shaky breath. She remembered her brother Michael's voice, bold, confident, and loving. "Live your life, stand tall. Don't let anyone diminish the honor of those we've lost." Those words anchored her. She pressed her lips together and stared into her coffee cup, finding a fragile calm amidst the ridicule. She could feel her pulse in her throat, each beat a reminder of the courage she carried within her. The mockers grew bolder, emboldened by her silence. One leaned closer to whisper, "Bet she thinks she's special or something." Another laughed, louder this time, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. Some averted their eyes, unwilling to witness what they sensed might become uncomfortable. Others, curious, glanced toward, but the gravity of her pain was not immediately apparent to them. Colonel could see it all, the subtle tremor in her fingers, the quiet tightening of her jaw, the way she maintained her dignity despite the sharp sting of humiliation. He knew that her silence was not submission but resilience. It was a demonstration of inner strength, the kind cultivated through love and loss, forged through grief and remembrance. That strength deserved acknowledgement, not derision. He remembered his own moments of helplessness, the times when he had witnessed loss and could do nothing but stand in silence. The death of Sergeant Mark had been one such moment. He had carried the weight of that loss with him for decades, learning to honor it in action and in memory. Now, observing, he recognized a parallel, a young woman carrying a burden that the world refused to acknowledge. The tension in the thickened. Patrons unconsciously sensed the shifting energy, the unspoken expectation of change. Could feel it too, a subtle presence nearby, steady and commanding. She did not yet know who it was, but something about the room felt different. She drew another breath, steadier this time, channeling the courage instilled in her by years of coping with grief and loss. The mockers, however, had not noticed the shift. Their laughter continued, louder and more reckless, a challenge to anyone who might intervene. "Look at that tattoo. Bet she thinks she's a hero just because her brother got blown up somewhere," one shouted, leaning back with a smug grin. Their ignorance was palpable, their arrogance a sharp contrast to the quiet dignity of and the unseen observer approaching her table. His mind worked with precision, honed by decades of leadership. He knew that the right gesture, executed silently, could communicate more than words ever could. It would not be about shamming the mockers, not about creating a spectacle, but about restoring dignity where it had been. Every step he took, every movement was deliberate. The weight of respect, memory, and honor guided him toward. His hands trembled slightly as she traced the outline of her tattoo with her fingers. She felt the sting of ridicule, yes, but also the familiar warmth of memory. Michael's presence lingered in her mind, a comforting echo of courage, laughter, and love. She whispered quietly under her breath, "I will stand. I will honor you." It was a promise, a declaration, and a shield against the ignorance surrounding her. Finally moved closer, his presence felt before it was seen. The room seemed to pause, though the mockers were oblivious, caught up in their own amusement. Every eye in that noticed him felt the subtle shift, a sense of seriousness, of impending acknowledgement, of something larger than the petty cruelty that had filled the morning air. His heart raced, a mix of fear, anticipation, and cautious hope. She did not yet know the man approaching her, but she sensed that he carried something significant, something that could, finally, give voice to the memory she had fought to preserve, something that could transform this moment from humiliation to honor. The stage was set. Though once a place of ordinary chatter, now held the weight of history, memory, and silent courage. The mockers had no idea that they were about to witness a lesson far beyond their comprehension, one that would redefine the meaning of respect, honor, and sacrifice in the space of a few quiet, deliberate moments. Drew in a slow, steadying breath, her fingers brushing the edge of the coffee cup. She felt herself bracing, not for confrontation, but for recognition, for someone to see her, fully and without judgment. In the midst of ridicule and ignorance, hope flickered like a fragile flame, fueled by the promise that dignity and honor could prevail even in the smallest of spaces. Colonel reached the final few steps, his presence commanding the room in subtle but unmistakable ways. Every eye was now aware, though no one yet understood the story that was about to unfold. The silence he carried was heavier than words, filled with intention, respect, and the promise of justice for memory and sacrifice alike. And in that moment, Sanders, trembling slightly but resolute, knew that whatever came next, it would matter not for the mockers, not for the world outside, but for the bond she had carried with her every day, the memory of her brother, and the dignity she refused to let fade. Colonel James stood a few feet from Sanders' table, the air around him thick with anticipation, though few in the realized it. The laughter of the mockers had grown louder, more reckless, as if to challenge anyone who might intervene, but was not here to challenge. He was here to honor. Every step he took carried decades of discipline, courage, and the silent weight of understanding what grief and sacrifice truly meant. Felt his presence before she saw him. There was a shift in the atmosphere, an unspoken gravity that demanded attention. Her heart raced, unsure of whether to feel fear or hope. She pressed her hands together in her lap, tracing the outline of the angel wings and dog tags tattooed on her forearm, grounding herself in the memory of her brother. The patrons began to notice the change, though they could not yet place it. The mockers, oblivious, still smirked and whispered among themselves. They had no idea that the man approaching was about to teach them a lesson that could not be laughed away. Every eye in the room now followed deliberate movements. Silence seemed to descend like a curtain, replacing the chatter, the clatter, and the laughter. When he reached the table, he stopped. No one moved. No one spoke. The felt like it had been suspended in time, the tension almost tangible. Looked at not as a stranger, not as a bystander, but as someone who carried a story worthy of recognition. He did not need to speak. Words would not do justice to the weight of her grief or the significance of her tribute. Slowly, deliberately, he began to remove his marine dress jacket. The movement was unhurried, purposeful, each action measured. The murmurs of curiosity began to rise from the surrounding patrons. Some leaned forward, sensing that something extraordinary was about to occur. Eyes widened, though she still did not fully understand what was coming. As removed his jacket, the tattoo on his forearm became visible. It was identical to hers, angel wings cradling dog tags. The room seemed to exhale as the significance sank in. Gasps rippled through the mockers froze mid-laugh, their arrogance evaporating instantly, replaced by the weight of realization. They had mocked what they did not understand, and now the truth was undeniable. Gently placed his jacket beside, careful not to make a spectacle, yet ensuring the gesture was fully seen. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft but carried the authority of someone who had lived through loss and honor alike. "For those who gave everything," he said quietly, "we wear their memory." The mockers' faces fell, replaced by shame and confusion. They had laughed at what they assumed was vanity or bravado, but now they saw the depth, the personal significance, and the unspoken courage behind the ink. Tears began to fall, hot and unrelenting, but they were no longer of shame. They were gratitude, relief, and validation all at once. Looked at, the man who had stepped into her world without judgment, who had recognized the weight of what she carried silently for years. She could feel the bond forming instantly, not of friendship, not of obligation, but of shared understanding. He had known loss just as she had, and his actions had given voice to the grief she had carried in silence. His eyes met hers with unflinching empathy. He could see the story behind her tattoo, the memories etched into her very being, and the strength it had taken for her to endure ridicule and grief alike. He had lost friends, 2 comrades who had fallen in the line of duty. He understood the gravity of loss, and he understood the power of recognition, of honoring memory through simple yet profound gestures. Around the patrons began to murmur among themselves. Some nodded, some whispered apologies, while others simply stared in awe. The mockers shrank under the weight of realization. They had mocked a symbol of bravery, love, and sacrifice, and now they understood the depth they had dismissed so thoughtlessly. His hands shook as she reached out to touch the edge of the jacket, the tactile connection grounding her in the reality of the moment. She could feel the power of what had just occurred. Someone had recognized her grief, her strength, and her memory in a way that no words could ever capture. She whispered a quiet, tearful thank you, though did not need to hear it. His presence, his gesture, had said everything. For the first time that morning, felt a profound sense of peace. The laughter, the ridicule, the isolation, it all melted away in the presence of understanding. She realized that her brother's memory was not just hers to carry. It was recognized, honored, and validated in ways that transcended the physical ink on her skin. Noticing her expression, gave a small, approving nod. The silent communication between them was enough, no explanation required, no justification necessary. Understood that honor was often expressed through deeds, through presence, through the simple act of acknowledging what others carried silently. The mockers, humbled and ashamed, did not speak. Their eyes met the tattoos, the jacket, the quiet dignity of and they finally understood that some stories were too sacred to mock, too profound to dismiss. One muttered a shaky apology, while another simply turned away, shame evident in every movement. As the slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the impact of the moment lingered. Patrons continued their breakfasts and coffees, but the lesson remained, etched in their minds as indelibly as the ink on his arm. Herself sat quietly, absorbing the significance, allowing the emotion to wash over her. She thought of her brother Michael, of his laughter, his bravery, and his love. She thought of the sacrifices made, the lives lost, and the importance of remembrance. In that quiet moment, she realized that honor and memory were not just about symbols or ceremonies. They were about recognition, understanding, and empathy, values that could be communicated through the simplest, most powerful gestures. Colonel, having completed the silent act of recognition, took a step back. He had not needed to lecture, to argue, or to confront. The gesture itself spoke volumes. He had demonstrated that courage and loss deserved acknowledgement, that memory could not be mocked, and that dignity required respect. Reached out one last time, brushing her fingers lightly against the jacket beside her. She whispered, barely audible even to herself, "Thank you for seeing me." In that moment, she knew that the grief she carried would never be diminished by ignorance or ridicule again. The memory of her brother was safe, honored, and shared, and she would never forget the man who had understood without a single word. The once a stage for mockery had become a testament to human dignity, empathy, and silent courage. And for Sanders and Colonel James, the memory of that morning, of the jacket, the tattoo, and the quiet acknowledgement would remain a defining moment, a story of honor that would endure far beyond the walls of the small town, that had settled into a quiet hum once again, but the air was still heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. The mockers, now subdued, had withdrawn to the far side of the room, their smirks replaced with shame. Other patrons, who had been observing silently, whispered to each other, some offering nods of respect, others simply staring in awe. But at its table, a deeper, more profound silence lingered, one filled with understanding, recognition, and the unspoken connection between two people who had known loss in its most raw form. Colonel James remained standing beside, his jacket carefully folded and placed beside her. The gesture had spoken volumes, but he knew that action alone, while powerful, was not enough. The human heart craved understanding, the sharing of experience that made one's own pain feel less solitary. And so, in the softest tone, he began to speak, not to lecture or command attention, but to connect. "My friend," began, gesturing gently toward the tattoo, this isn't just a piece of art, it's memory, sacrifice, and love." He paused, watching his eyes glisten as tears continued to fall. I know because I carry a story like yours. Looked up at him, curiosity mingling with her cautious hope. She hadn't expected words beyond the gesture. She had not expected to meet someone who truly understood the depth of what she carried. You understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. Nodded. I do. His eyes softened, reflecting decades of experience, grief, and compassion. He told her about Sergeant Mark, his closest friend in the Marines, killed in an operation overseas. He spoke of the shock, the anger, and the long nights haunted by memories of a life cut short. He explained how the loss had shaped him, how he had learned to honor those who had given everything, not just through medals or ceremonies, but through silent acknowledgement, memory, and respect. Listened, captivated. She realized almost immediately that their grief was not the same. She had lost a brother, he a comrade, yet the pain, the love, the unspoken need to honor those who had died was universal. It resonated deeply within her. For the first time that morning, she felt seen not just for her tattoo, but for the story it represented. Continued. I knew your brother, he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. Michael Sanders. He was brave, disciplined, and someone the world would have been better for having around longer. I remember him from a memorial after the operation. He made an impression on everyone who served alongside him. His breath caught in her throat. Her chest ached with a mixture of grief and awe. You knew him, she asked, disbelief and emotion mingling. You knew Michael? Nodded again. I did, and I remember his courage, his dedication. Losing him, it's something I carry with me just as you do. That tattoo you wear, it's not just for you. It's for all of us who remember, who honor, who refuse to forget. Felt a wave of emotion overwhelm her. For years, she had carried this grief silently, misunderstood by many and mocked by others. Now, here was someone who had not only witnessed her pain but shared it, who had known her brother and respected his life. The tears that flowed were no longer of humiliation. They were of connection, recognition, and profound relief. The patrons of the observed quietly, sensing the emotional depth unfolding at its table. Some whispered among themselves, others simply watched, moved by the silent power of shared grief. Even the mockers, now subdued and unable to look away, seemed to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a lesson in empathy and human dignity far beyond their comprehension. Took a deep breath and whispered, I never expected anyone to understand like this, especially not today. Smiled softly, the lines of his face softened by empathy. Understanding often comes quietly, he said. Sometimes it's not in speeches or lectures. Sometimes it's in gestures, in witnessing, in sharing a story that someone else will carry forward. The two of them sat together, the initial tension dissolving into a quiet dialogue of shared memory. Recounted moments from her childhood with Michael, his mischievous laughter, the way he protected her, his bravery and loyalty. Shared memories of his time in the field with Sergeant, of the camaraderie, the bonds forged in life-and-death situations, and the indescribable grief of loss. The connection between them grew, subtle yet undeniable. They were strangers only by circumstance, but their shared understanding bridged every gap. For it was a moment of solace she had never expected in a small town. For it was a chance to honor another life lost, another story carried forward, another bond strengthened by recognition and respect. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours as they shared stories, as the world outside receded. Realized something profound. Grief, when shared, became less isolating. Memory, when witnessed, became more powerful. And honor, when acknowledged, became eternal. The mockers, who had once filled the room with laughter and ignorance, remained silent. Their initial arrogance had dissolved into humility, a lesson taught without force, without anger, but through the quiet power of recognition and shared humanity. His eyes met once more. Thank you, she whispered, voice steady this time, not just for today but for seeing him and for seeing me. Nodded, understanding the depth of what she meant. We carry those we love in memory and in action. Never forget that you are not alone in carrying him forward. Every time you honor him, every time you share his story, you keep him alive. And that's the most important legacy anyone can leave. The slowly returning to its ordinary rhythm now felt different, charged with a quiet reverence. Patrons continued their breakfasts and coffees, but the lesson lingered. The story unfolding at its table had transformed the space, teaching those who witnessed it about respect, empathy, and the profound weight of memory. Looked down at her tattoo, tracing the angel wings and dog tags with her fingertips. They were no longer just a symbol of grief or loss. They were a bridge to understanding, a testament to courage, and a connection to those who truly understood sacrifice. For the first time in years, she felt both grief and peace coexisting, the two intertwined in a way that gave meaning to every moment she had carried alone. Colonel finally stood, his task complete for now. His presence had spoken volumes, his stories had connected, and his silent gesture had transformed not only his mourning but her entire sense of how the world could honor memory. They would leave the changed, not by confrontation, but by recognition, understanding, and shared humanity. Took a final deep breath, feeling lighter yet profoundly touched. She realized that this moment would stay with her forever, a chapter in her own story of grief, resilience, and honor. The memory of her brother, her courage, and the silent recognition of Colonel had become a permanent part of her life, a reminder that even in a world quick to mock or misunderstand, empathy and honor could prevail. The had regained its familiar hum, the clinking of cups and quiet conversations returning to the background. Yet the energy was changed, imperceptibly to some, profoundly to others. Those who had witnessed the interaction between Sanders and Colonel James could feel it, a lingering weight of significance, a subtle reminder that some moments mattered far more than the everyday noise surrounding them. Sat quietly at her table, her hands folded in her lap, tracing the contours of the angel wings tattooed on her forearm. The design, once a private tribute to her late brother, now felt transformed. It had become a symbol not only of loss and memory but also of recognition, courage, and empathy. She could feel the eyes of the patrons on her, yet their gazes were no longer mocking. They carried curiosity, respect, and a touch of wonder, the kind of recognition that comes only when one truly sees a person, their story, and their resilience. The mockers remained seated, subdued, their earlier bravado replaced by silence. The moment had humbled them, forcing them to confront the consequences of thoughtlessness. They had laughed at what they could not understand, mocked what they had never truly considered. Now, in the quiet aftermath of Colonel's gesture, they were left to reckon with their ignorance. Some stared at the floor, some averted their eyes, and one, timidly, whispered a shaky apology toward, unsure if words could ever repair what had been attempted in mockery. His eyes lifted, meeting the apology. She nodded faintly, a small acknowledgement that the gesture was received. She did not need grand apologies or loud declarations. The silence, the reflection, and the subtle recognition were enough. She had learned through grief and loss that dignity could not always be demanded, but it could be reclaimed, quietly and deliberately in moments like this. Colonel remained standing nearby, observing. He had stepped into this space not to chastise, not to lecture, but to honor. His actions had spoken where words might have failed. And now, as the immediate tension eased, he allowed himself a moment to reflect as well. Every gesture had a weight, every action had a consequence, and every moment of recognition mattered. He had not only honored his grief, but had also reminded those present of the power of empathy and respect. Thus other patrons, initially silent observers, began to murmur among themselves. They discussed the significance of what they had witnessed, some quietly praising his resilience, others expressing admiration for Colonel's understated but profound action. The lesson was clear. Some forms of courage do not shout. They manifest through quiet presence, through gestures that carry meaning far beyond words. Felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. The morning had begun with humiliation, ridicule, and a sense of isolation. By its end, it had transformed into a space of reflection, recognition, and connection. She realized that grief could be shared without diminishing its depth, and that memory could be honored in ways that transcended personal loss. She thought of her brother Michael, imagining him smiling, proud of the dignity she had preserved and the recognition she had received. Spoke again, this time to the room, though his voice remained soft and calm. "We often forget the value of observing and understanding," he said. "It's easy to mock what we do not understand, to dismiss what seems different or unfamiliar. But every person carries a story, and every story deserves recognition. Honor is not given lightly, but it can be shown through awareness, presence, and respect." The patrons absorbed his words in silence, the lesson sinking in without the need for conflict or drama. The mockers, still subdued, began to reflect inwardly, recognizing their own shortcomings and the depth of what they had dismissed so thoughtlessly. They had witnessed courage, empathy, and dignity unfold before them, not in words, not in confrontation, but through action and silent acknowledgement. Gaze met, a silent understanding passing between them. She realized that the act of recognition had extended beyond her personal story. It had become a lesson for everyone present, a testament to the idea that even small gestures could carry profound meaning. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that her brother's memory would continue to inspire, not only in her life, but in the lives of those who had witnessed this morning's events. Colonel approached table once more, kneeling slightly to meet her at eye level. "You carry him with honor," he said quietly, "and through you, others can see what true courage looks like. Never forget that your story matters not just to you, but to everyone who has the wisdom to see it." Nodded, tears still glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing him and for seeing me." Gave a small, approving nod. "That's what honor does," he said. "It acknowledges, it remembers, and it inspires." The gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Patrons resumed their breakfasts and conversations, but the lesson lingered. The significance of silent courage, the power of recognition, and the depth of empathy had permeated the space, leaving a subtle but indelible mark. Even the mockers, though uncomfortable, would carry the memory of the morning with them, a quiet reminder that actions have consequences and that dignity deserves acknowledgement. Sat quietly for a few more moments, reflecting on the morning's events. She thought about her brother, about the pain of loss, and about the resilience that had carried her through years of grief. She realized that courage was not only in surviving hardship but in preserving dignity, honoring memory, and allowing oneself to be seen, even when the world seemed unkind. Rose to leave, his presence still commanding respect without a word. Watched him go, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and connection. Though their paths would diverge after this morning, the bond forged through shared understanding, grief, and honor would remain a part of her life forever. As the settled into the late morning lull, traced the tattoo on her arm once more. She felt a renewed strength, a quiet empowerment, and an understanding that her story, her brother's memory, and her dignity were resilient, impervious to ridicule, strengthened by recognition, and eternal in their significance. The mockers, having absorbed the lesson, eventually left the quietly, humbled and thoughtful. Their laughter and ignorance were replaced by reflection, the memory of the morning serving as a subtle but powerful reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding. In that small, an ordinary space transformed into a place of extraordinary significance. Sanders, carrying her grief and honor, had been recognized. Colonel James, through silent presence and careful action, had taught a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of the. And the patrons, having witnessed it all, left with a newfound appreciation for the power of dignity, empathy, and the human capacity to honor memory. For it was more than a morning. It was a turning point, a reminder that grief could be shared, honor could be acknowledged, and courage could be recognized without words. She knew that in time, the story of this morning would remain with her, a lasting testament to the power of silent recognition, shared memory, and the enduring strength of those who carry love and loss with dignity. The had returned to its quiet rhythm, but Sanders knew that nothing about the morning would ever feel ordinary again. The sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the small tables and the lingering scent of freshly brewed coffee. Yet, it was not the aroma of that filled the room. It was the resonance of shared understanding, of lessons learned, and of dignity quietly reclaimed. Sat at her table, her hands folded, tracing the edges of the tattoo on her forearm. The angel wings that cradled dog tags no longer felt like a private memorial. They were a bridge connecting her to her brother Michael, to Colonel James, and, in some subtle way, to everyone who had witnessed what had occurred. The mockers had left, their arrogance replaced with quiet contemplation. The other patrons, though returning to their routines, carried with them an unspoken acknowledgement of what they had seen. Courage, empathy, and honor cannot be mocked, for they transcend ignorance. Colonel had returned to his seat briefly, nodding with a quiet reassurance. There was no need for words. Their bond, forged in shared understanding and recognition, was already established. Felt the weight of relief and gratitude wash over her. For years she had carried her grief silently, misunderstood and often mocked. Today she had been seen, truly seen, and it had changed everything. The memory of Michael Sanders came alive again in her mind. She remembered his laughter, his bravery, the way he had protected her, and the countless moments of small kindness and mischievous humor that defined their bond. The tattoo had always been a tribute, but now it was also a testament, a symbol of how love, memory, and courage endure even in the face of ignorance and mockery. Colonel leaned slightly closer, his voice soft but carrying the weight of authority tempered by compassion. "Remember," he said, "what you carry is not only yours to bear. It's a story that others can learn from, a lesson in courage, grief, and honor. By living fully, by showing strength and dignity, you honor not only your brother but everyone who has sacrificed." Nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks. I understand now," she whispered. "It's not just about him or me. It's about showing the world that honor matters, even when it's invisible to those who don't understand." His eyes softened. "Exactly. Courage doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's in a gesture, a presence, a tattoo that carries decades of memory. What you carry is sacred. Today, you reminded everyone here of that." Drew a steadying breath and smiled faintly, feeling a newfound sense of empowerment. The morning had begun with ridicule and shame, but it had ended with validation, respect, and understanding. She realized that the world could mock, dismiss, and misunderstand, but the memory of those we love and the honor we carry cannot be taken away. As they sat together, Colonel shared more stories of his experiences, not only of loss but of resilience, friendship, and the quiet victories that often go unnoticed. He spoke of soldiers who had returned from battle changed, of comrades who had passed away, and of the small acts of recognition that had sustained him through years of service. Listened intently, absorbing each word, each lesson, each moment of shared humanity. The patrons, though returning to their own breakfasts and conversations, could not help but notice the gravity of the exchange at table. Some watched quietly, reflecting on the morning's events. Others, previously oblivious, now understood that the world was richer and deeper than surface appearances suggested. Even the mockers, though gone, would carry the lesson with them, a subtle but permanent mark left by an act of silent dignity and recognition. Thought about her future, about how she would carry forward the lessons of this day. She realized that the tattoo on her arm was more than a symbol of grief. It was a symbol of resilience, of memory, and of the enduring power of honor. She knew that she could face ridicule, misunderstanding, and ignorance without losing the essence of her courage. What mattered most was the integrity with which she carried her story and the lives she honored. Colonel, noticing her contemplative expression, gave a small, approving nod. "Your brother's story lives through you," he said. "And through moments like this, it lives in others as well. never underestimate the impact of quietly honoring someone's memory. Smiled through tears, feeling a profound sense of connection to the man beside her, to her brother, and to the lessons that had unfolded in them. She understood now that grief, when acknowledged and shared, could be transformative. Memory, when honored, could inspire others. And courage, when lived with integrity, had a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The morning stretched on, the now calm and filled with reflection rather than chatter. Finished her coffee slowly, savoring not only the warmth of the drink but the significance of what had occurred. She felt stronger, lighter, and more grounded than she had in years. The morning had been a journey from ridicule and shame to recognition and empowerment. It was a lesson she would carry with her forever. Before leaving, stood and glanced once more at Colonel. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "For today, for seeing him, for reminding me that honor endures." Smiled, a mixture of pride and quiet humility in his expression. "Carry it forward," he said simply. "Honor never truly ends. It lives in memory, in action, and in the lives of those who recognize it. Today, you reminded everyone here that it matters." Left the sunlight warming her face as she stepped outside. Each breath felt lighter, freer. She knew that grief would always be a part of her, that memory would remain etched in her heart, and that her brother's legacy would continue through her actions, her courage, and the stories she carried forward. For the patrons, the morning had been transformative as well. They returned to their lives with a subtle but lasting lesson, that empathy, recognition, and honor could exist quietly, profoundly, and without fanfare. Some would share the story with friends and family. Others would carry it silently, a private reminder that courage and dignity often reside where one least expects it. The mockers who had attempted to diminish pain would also carry the lesson, whether consciously or not. The weight of their ignorance had been met with silent understanding, and the result was humility, reflection, and perhaps the beginning of empathy. Their laughter no longer held power. It had been replaced by recognition of the depth of human experience beyond their comprehension. His tattoo, once a personal tribute, had become a symbol of something larger, of the courage to endure, the strength to honor, and the power of silent acknowledgement. It reminded her that honor is never diminished by ignorance, that memory lives in the hearts of those who cherish it, and that acts of recognition, no matter how small, can have profound effects. As she walked away from she felt a sense of closure but also of continuity. Her brother Michael's memory was alive, honored, and recognized. The courage she carried within her was strengthened, validated, and eternal. Colonel had shown her, in the simplest of ways, that dignity, empathy, and honor could prevail, even in the face of ridicule, misunderstanding, and indifference. And as moved forward, she knew she would carry this lesson into the world. That grief, memory, and courage are intertwined, that silent recognition can speak louder than words, and that the acts of empathy we extend to others can leave a mark far beyond the moment, inspiring hope, dignity, and honor wherever they reach. The morning had begun with laughter, ignorance, and mockery, but it ended with reflection, connection, and enduring respect. Sanders left the changed, strengthened by grief, validated by recognition, and empowered by the understanding that honor, when truly acknowledged, never fades. For Colonel James, the morning had also been a reminder that quiet gestures can create profound impact, that recognition matters as much as action, and that the bonds forged through shared understanding of loss are among the most meaningful in life. Together, he had shown that memory and honor, when treated with respect, can transcend ridicule, touch hearts, and transform ordinary spaces into places of profound significance.